you'll see that many of the points Kevin was making will be reinforced and supported with some data, some surveys, and then in a couple of areas I think we can have some interesting discussion around where there might be a little bit of a difference of opinion, maybe where we can bring in some additional points, specifically around the retailers and consumer willingness to pay. So as I go through my presentation, I think you'll see some similarities, some differences, and hopefully that will prompt some questions at the end. I'm trying to go through this fairly quickly. If you have questions, save them to the end, but please be aware that this presentation will be made available to all of you, and one of the things that IBM is trying to do is to facilitate discussion around traceability and what we're calling smart food online, and we'll be sending out invitations to everyone to join that discussion online as and when you can. So first thing I'm going to do is talk about some of the global trends impacting the food industry, impacting consumers, impacting the consumer packaged goods industry. And I think this is all important because this provides a broad context for some of the things that we think are happening with the consumer, not just here in the U.S., but globally, in terms of the way that consumers interact with their products, the demands that they have, the expectations that they have from products, and to sort of build on Kevin's point around their willingness to pay and what they're looking for from their products. And also, fundamentally, how the food industry is going through a very, very dramatic period of change. For the last 100 years, quite honestly, the food industry and the consumer packaged goods industry, which for me is companies like Nestle and Unilever and Kraft and PepsiCo, Sara Lee, those are the companies I deal with on a day-to-day basis. Their business has not really changed that much in the last 100 years. In the last 3 to 5 years, they've really seen a profound amount of change, and as they look to the next 3 to 5 years, they can see a lot more change happening. And it's really driving a lot of very difficult decisions around investments and priorities in those companies, and those decisions and the similar types of decisions happening at retailers are going to have implications for all of us as consumers as well as upstream in the supply chain. So some of those trends that we see happening are population growth. My next chart will give you some specific data on that, but I don't think it's a secret to anyone in the room that there's more of us. There may not be more of us in the room today than there were yesterday, but on the planet, there is more of us on the planet each and every day, and that trend is likely to continue. Consumer demand is changing. Not only are there more of us, but what we're buying and the expectations we have are changing. We have this issue of climate change, and if you put aside the Al Gore, is the planet burning up, or is the planet getting hotter or cooler, I think we can all agree that the climate is changing globally and ocean temperatures are rising, and that is driving some very difficult decisions around the globe about where we grow food, how much food we grow. There's drought going on in most of the major agricultural regions in the world. Australia is in the middle of a 9-year drought. Their rice production has dropped 98% in that time. That's pretty dramatic. That's not something that you can really argue with. Fossil fuels. Clearly fossil fuels play an integral role in the food supply across the board, whether it's moving product, growing product, fertilizing it, processing it, storing it, cooling it, and changes in fossil fuels and fossil fuel prices will drive major changes in the way the industry is structured. Even around things like where stores are located, where distribution centers are located, how product is moved, how far it's moved, and how much that food costs at the end of the day. Arable land, not only is there concerns around drought and water, major concerns and huge changes happening around the globe in terms of who owns arable land and how productive that land is, and what's going to happen to that land in the future. So we're seeing countries that are major food importers view food as a security issue, a national security issue, and take steps to address that national security issue by securing their food supply by buying up farmland around the world. Seoul, Daewoo out of Korea, tried to lease 1 million hectares of land in Madagascar to grow palm oil as part of that. Other companies in Korea also looking to control huge amounts of farmland. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries who are oil exporters but food importers are looking at where can they buy or lease under 100-year leases huge amounts of farmland so that they can have food security. Very, very big issue. The CIA is, the U.S. government is identifying food as a national security issue and water as a national security issue. And that brings me to the last point, water. We all take it for granted. There's a growing understanding of the amount of water that's used to produce various products, to move those, and the fact that there's an existing global trade in virtual water. Companies and countries are starting to understand that the commodities that they buy are not just worth the commodity price, but the underlying water that's required to grow those. So some very profound changes going on in our food industry. I talked about population growth. At the end of 2008, there were 6.8 billion of us running around on the planet. By 2050, there'll be over 9 billion of us. Many, many of those people will be living in emerging markets. Many, many of those people will be living in cities. Those people, even if they consumed at the same rate they are today, would put unsustainable pressures on our food system. But they don't. As their income grows, they want to buy more protein, and that puts even more pressure on our food supply. So as we look at this issue of traceability, you may be thinking as I go through this, where does this all come back to traceability? You'll see that all of these issues are going to place a high premium on knowing where food came from, what impact it had, and making sure that we're making smart decisions about allocating resources. So more people on the planet putting more pressure on resources across a wide range of issues. We saw some pretty severe political consequences last year as a result of this. We saw countries like Thailand and India restricting exports of basic commodities, rice. We saw food riots in developing countries. Mexico, there was huge protests around the prices of corn. So there's some very, very major issues, I guess is my fundamental point, around food, something that we've taken for granted, and that here in the U.S. we pay 10% of our disposable income to buy. When we look at water in particular, I don't think many of the statistics here will be a real surprise to you, but as IBM looks at this, we see this as a huge, huge issue, and quite honestly for us a business opportunity to help companies and countries better manage water and to understand the water footprints. Carbon footprints are getting a lot of attention in the media and amongst business. It's important, but we think the far bigger issue is going to be around water and water footprints and understanding how much water is used in growing certain products, in preparing them and storing them. And companies and countries, again, as they get this understanding, are going to make very different decisions based on things like water and the availability of water. We already see across the U.S. huge tensions arising across state borders over the control of water. Atlanta and Lake Lanier and the problems they had last year around the availability of water is just one example. We also see, if you think about the global population growth and these consumption changes, one of the interesting things to think about is in China and the Chinese population growth and their consumption of pork. Now, the table on this slide sort of shows how Chinese pork consumption has changed between 1990 and 2005, and there's a lot of data there. But to bring it all home to you, basically what's happened is that there's more Chinese eating more pork, and to supply that incremental pork, you need a landmass equal to the size of the state of Georgia to grow those extra sows. So, we only have so many states of Georgia. We only have so much farmland. And as this trend continues across other countries, India, Africa, we're really just going to run into a limitation on the amount of land and water that we have, and we're going to have to be much smarter about how we allocate resources. The other thing that's going on in the background here is that a huge amount of the food that we actually produce is wasted. Estimates are that 50% of the food is lost somewhere in the supply chain between where it's grown and the farmer. 50%. And if we start thinking about the water cost of that, 80% of the world's, 60, 78%, pick your number, of the world's water goes into agriculture. And we need to be smarter about this limited resource and the 50% of the food that's wasted. Traceability can play a role there in ensuring more efficient movements, more effective movements of those commodities. We also see pressures and changes across a number of other dimensions. I'm not going to go read through this slide. You can do that at your leisure on a nice Friday evening with a glass of wine. Some great reading for you. But as we look across the food value chain, we see huge changes in consumers and the way consumers interact with products and retailers. We see very different marketing of products and the attributes. We see a very, very complex global food supply chain as a result of specialization and outsourcing and globalization. I won't bore you with some of the statistics about how much of our food is imported, how many ports of entry there are, but suffice it to say our global food supply is becoming much more complex. Some of the recalls that we've had over the last couple of years, notably pet food, highlighted the complexity of the food supply as well as the specialization and the fact that there was one company that was making the pet food for about 130 different pet food brands, but then as you went further up the supply chain, there was multiple handoff points and processors feeding into that one manufacturer. The criticality of data and information, I don't think I have to drive home that point around how important information is across the food supply chain in terms of understanding not only where it came from, but the impact that it's having, weather conditions, pricing, identifying it. Data is becoming more valuable in many ways than the underlying commodity, and we're seeing this happen in a lot of other industries too. And then regulation. I don't think we can make the assumption that regulation is going to get any less. If anything, regulation is going to just continue to increase as these pressures around water and food supply and arable land and population growth and food security rise up the nation's priority. We're going to see more and more regulation as we try and exert greater control over that food supply and preserve it from a security perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and from a safety perspective. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about in a little more detail is the consumer. Now, we came up with this term, the omni-consumer. We did some surveys in the U.S. and the U.K. and also in China around consumer perceptions of products. And I had to dig into my dictionary and thesaurus to come up with some of these words, but we came up with this term omni-consumer. The idea fundamentally is that the consumer that goes into the grocery store today is more empowered, informed, and concerned than they ever have been before. And they're concerned with a much wider range of issues when they pick up a product, when they look at a product. And I agree wholeheartedly with Kevin that in many ways this has been a niche consumer, or niche consumer, but we see this growing and becoming much more mainstream, and consumers in general expanding the list of issues that they're concerned about when they buy a product. So it used to be that they were focused on product and packaging. They would buy the Raisin Bran, and the concern was how big is the box, how many raisins are there, is the Raisin Bran crunchy? Now there's more concern about the source of the raisins, the nutritional information. We have a huge amount of food allergy information that now has to go on products. So the amount of information that consumers expect from products has increased. Whether they're willing to pay for it is another question. And I think Kevin's point about the gap between what people say they're willing to pay and what they actually pay is quite honestly one of the holy grails for the consumer packaged goods industry, is trying to connect the dots there between what people say and what they actually do. And believe me, there's a lot of the major consumer packaged goods companies trying to connect that dot and understand whether consumers really are willing to pay more for which specific attributes. So fundamentally, a very different consumer out there, looking at a much wider range of issues. IBM did a survey, and this probably be a few things as I go through this presentation that will surprise you about IBM doing this. IBM does a huge amount of consumer surveys. One of my counterparts covers the retail industry, and every year we survey about 30,000 U.S. shoppers to get their perceptions about what's important when they buy at different stores, whether it's an apparel store, a drugstore, or a grocery store. We surveyed U.S. and U.K. consumers around this issue of food safety and traceability. And more than 50% of them said that they wanted more, or said that they were already more knowledgeable. We asked them to sort of say, okay, based on where you are today versus where you were 2 years ago, are you more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable? And in general, consumers said, I'm already more knowledgeable about the products that I buy than I was 2 years ago. My awareness is higher about what's in them and where they came from. But an even higher percentage of people then said to us, we would like even more information. Now the challenge is for the CPG companies is to figure out how do I effectively get that information to the consumer. The package is only so big. The amount of time that a consumer spends picking a product is only so long. You might have 90 seconds at the Wendy's drive-through, but Procter & Gamble has figured out you have about 9 seconds to influence somebody picking a laundry detergent. How do you communicate information to them effectively? That's one of the big challenges, is around communicating this information. To Kevin's point, too, around who do you trust in the event of a recall, there is a much higher level of trust in the U.S. and the UK in the grocery store than the manufacturer, for exactly the reasons Kevin mentioned, that people associate the recall with the branded manufacturer. Branded manufacturers are understanding this, and we'll get into some of the implications around that. If we look at over the last 3-4 years, and this is by no means a complete set of recalls, there's been a huge number of recalls. I don't feel comfortable saying whether there's been more or less recalls. I do feel comfortable saying that the recalls have been much higher profile. We had the largest ground beef recall. We had the largest recall of any product with the peanut butter recall. And the fact that these recalls have been dragged out in terms of their duration has meant that they stayed in the news for a long, long time. Over time, what we think is that there's an accumulated erosion of this word trust. Trust in brands, trust in products, trust in the USDA. Overall consumer trust across a wide range of products has decreased. We all know that we don't trust the government, broadly speaking. That is carrying over into other aspects. It's carrying over to drugs. It's carrying over to food. When we asked consumers as part of this survey to name a product that was recalled, people could dig back 12 to 18 months and name specific brands of products that were recalled. If you look at Peter Pan peanut butter that was pulled off the shelf, that was the number 3 peanut butter brand in the US when it was first recalled. Sales of that have not recovered. It was reintroduced, I think, in August of last year. Sales of that brand has been destroyed by the recall. So there is this accumulating level of distrust around brands because of the continued high level and high profile of recalls. And I put Walmart on there too, and I think this is a very interesting point. If you look at what Walmart is doing publicly and behind the scenes, one of the things that they're trying to do is not necessarily level the playing field with a Whole Foods, but they understand that there is this omni-consumer and that there is this consumer who, when they go into the store, they want to feel good about the products that they buy, and they're applying a much broader definition of what good is. Walmart is trying to bring their products up to a level of standard, not comparable to Whole Foods, but to make consumers at those stores feel good about their products. They're requiring that all of the frozen shrimp sold through Walmart is traced back to specific farms, and it's not just the source, but the environmental impact that those shrimp farms are having, whether it's in Vietnam or Thailand. They want to know which farm it came from, whether there was any runoff, what impact those farms are having on local communities, and not because they're going to report that specific level of information to consumers, but they want to be able to say to consumers, we have a responsible supply chain. We care about the world. We care about water and population growth, and we're doing something to address it. Walmart's latest announcement about their sustainability index has some components of traceability in it. They want suppliers to be able to identify all of the manufacturing plants where their products come from. Okay, that's not identifying every single animal that's sold through Walmart, but it's a step in that direction. And that's clearly not a niche consumer. Walmart is understanding, and one of the things they want to do is calculate a sustainability index. It's not a carbon footprint, it's not a water footprint, it's more holistic than that. But you can see where this is going around information, collecting information from the supply chain and communicating it to the consumer. Proliferation of claims. One of the things that we see around food products in general is just a wide range of claims about their efficacy, their sustainability, their responsibility. And one of the things, again, that's eroded consumer trust is that many of these claims have been debunked shortly after they were made. And this is just a few examples of them. Walker's is a bag of potato chips in the UK. They actually have a carbon footprint that they've calculated for those. You know, not to get into the nitty-gritty, but IBM has a point of view that it's not really supportable to calculate a carbon footprint for an individual product at this point. Some companies are starting to do it. It's a bit of a marketing, I won't say gimmick, I almost did. But the calculation of that is just too difficult, too complex to put a single number on a product and say that's its carbon footprint. It doesn't really mean anything at this point. And you won't see any carbon footprints on any IBM products for some time to come for that reason. But anyway, companies are picking up on this. Consumers want to feel good about it. Consumers are looking for these things. Hey, my bag of chips has a carbon footprint. It must be good. It must be better. Will they pay a little bit more for it? Don't know. This information thing is going even beyond products, and these are just a few examples of what's happening online around consumers going around companies and around governments to share information about products and where they came from and what's in them and whether they're good for you. There's a number of websites dedicated to specific categories of product where consumers will share information about a cleaning product and all the ingredients that are in there and all the side effects of those ingredients. There's a website that will allow you to track the grain in your bread or flour back to a specific farm. It's not done by the government, it's not done by any companies, but it's out there, and it uses barcode information and location information to provide that to consumers. How many consumers go there and really make a purchasing decision based on that? I don't know, but it's indicative of where this is going. It's a trend, it's happening, and we just have to figure out what to do about it. If we do see what's going on in the U.S., and when it comes to traceability, I left that blank intentionally. If you compare what the Japanese are doing and how they're marketing and dealing with traceability, and then how we're dealing with traceability at the moment in the U.S., I think there's a pretty clear gap around the level of detail and the amount of information. We'll just have to figure out how we address that. So fundamentally, really what I'm talking about is the ability of a traceability system to empower brands at the end of the day for consumer packaged goods companies to connect with consumers. Kevin's points around the economics of traceability, you can't argue with those, but there has to be a way for this to work because the consumer's demanding it, the retailers are demanding it, the retailers are already incorporating it into their marketing. So the wave is coming, it's coming upstream, and the technology, as Kevin said, is not the issue. We have to figure out the way to make it happen. We view traceability as what we call the mortar that holds the bricks together in the brand value proposition. Now, traditionally, you took food safety for granted in the product, and so I positioned that as the foundation of the house. Then you had the intrinsic attributes of a product. How did it taste? How did it look? Was it a big package, a small package? So did you get good value for it? But now what we're seeing is in a lot more cases, and if you pick up pretty much any product in the store, there's a lot of other attributes that are being marketed as valuable. Freshness dates on your beer. 5 years ago, nobody cared about the freshness date on your beer. But now that's one of the most important attributes on the beer. A cold supply chain for your beer is marketed. It's not necessarily how it tastes. It's a bigger marketing message around the data, the information, the provenance of the products. Now, traceability systems clearly can deliver value across the supply chain. I didn't see some of the earlier presentations around the business case. The business case, we think, for traceability encompasses, obviously, compliance issues, and we think those are only going to grow as regulation, government regulation increases, but also retailer and restaurant mandates increase. If we look at what's happening in Thailand and Vietnam with chicken, they are also rapidly advancing their capabilities in traceability there, because so much of the chicken from Thailand and Vietnam ends up in chicken McNuggets in Europe. And McDonald's is requiring their suppliers to provide certification on those products. Risk mitigation, clearly, with all the product recalls that we've had. Supply chain efficiency. As you move downstream in the supply chain from the farmer, the efficient movement of goods becomes much, much more important. And the ability to track and trace, reduce inventories, reduce holding times, ensure efficient movements of goods to reduce carbon and water footprints becomes more valuable. And then brand empowerment. Yep. For the agri-food industry, there's really three main dimensions of traceability: identifying the location of where products came from, the specific products, whether it's a batch, a lot, an individual cow, a cohort group, and then the movements. And the objective is to be able to provide a complete history of those attributes to anyone in the supply chain on a permission basis. And I'll get to a slide here that identifies at a high level what we think the architecture could look like. It's not a detailed architecture diagram, believe me, that's over my head, but it just gives you some ideas to some of the basic components. Now, one of the other issues that's come up quite frequently is the security issue and the government getting involved and a mandate. I think it's worthwhile taking a step back, and I have to give credit to one of my counterparts here, who I think some of you have met, John Graham out of Canada, for putting this slide together. And I think it's just a very thoughtful way of thinking about traceability and some of the security issues. You know, we already provide a lot of personal information and use personal information in our day-to-day lives. Traceability is secure. It has to be secure information and shared in a secured environment. But we already do that with the government in a lot of other examples. We do it with our tax returns and tax ID numbers. We do it with the mail, giving out our mailing address, our zip code, sending private documents through the mail. We do it with ATM transactions, where you have unique identifiers and you're giving account numbers and PIN numbers, and that's shared online. You do it with the food value chain, with your loyalty cards and credit card payment information. So fundamentally, I think the security issue, as with the technology issue, can be taken and put aside, because the technology exists and we already share very personal, private, secure information in many of the transactions that we do today. Fundamentally, what we're recommending is a move to what we call full value traceability, which is a much more holistic view of traceability. It's not looking at individual components of the supply chain. We have to be respectful of individual components of the supply chain and the business case that exists for investments in each one of those. But I think a broader understanding across the three dimensions Kevin mentioned, supermarkets, restaurants, the export markets, and where products end up and the value that's created and how that value can be shared across the supply chain, has to be part of the overall discussion. And a recognition that we don't operate in a silo, we are part of a value chain. And that value chain is global, it's complex, it has multiple players, but we are part of that value chain whether we like it or not. We supply McDonald's with beef, and McDonald's is going to increase the level of requirements that they have around their products. We have to figure out how to share the value so that it's cost effective at one end of the supply chain to support the needs at the other end. That one is just kind of interesting. We've already done, IBM has done work piloting traceability systems in a number of countries. A lot of work in the Nordics with pork producers out of Norway. We've done a lot of work in Thailand and Vietnam around seafood traceability, and in Canada. One of the things that we did in Canada was a proof of concept that proved the viability of an end-to-end multi-product traceability system. It wasn't huge in scale, but it did prove the technological viability of a traceability system. One of the questions that always comes up is around a centralized infrastructure versus distributed. We believe that fundamentally, regardless of what happens in terms of a mandate or a voluntary system, the data that is integral to a traceability system should reside with the individual companies that produce that data. They should own it. It's their data, but then we can create permission-based access to that data in the event that there's a problem or that there's an inquiry around a specific shipment or lot or customer. That access can be provided on a permission basis in a secure environment, and everyone retains control of their own data. You don't have to report it into the government, a large central government database. Maybe there's a role for one of the cooperatives or trade organizations to act as a central repository for the rest of the industry, for some of the smaller producers to get over some of the cost hurdles. And you could, as a small farmer, upload an Excel file, another type of flat file, and that data would then be put into the bigger database for access by the larger retailers and manufacturers. But the technology issues, the cost issues can be overcome, allowing people to retain control of their data in a secure environment. And then we can provision that data across the rest of the supply chain to everyone else as they need it, how they need it. Now, we're not going to be necessarily allowing consumers to scan barcodes and identify specific lot numbers yet, although we're starting to do that with eggs. You can put an individual barcode now on an egg, and there's some companies that are doing that and allowing consumers to trace eggs back to the individual farms where they were grown with a unique barcode on them. We don't have to go to that level of detail, but you can create the access to the information using the existing technologies, and data standards is the other key part of this, is having a consistent view, a view of what individual items are, what individual locations are, that everyone understands through a standardized system. That's another part of the existing traceability environment that's somewhat lacking. Upstream in the supply chain with retailers and manufacturers, they've already addressed this standards issue using GS1. The agri-food side of the business, unfortunately, a lot of the individual countries and provincial governments are setting up their own standards for identifying locations and other integral units. We'll have to figure out a way of creating a Rosetta Stone, if you like, to allow all those different entities upstream to understand what exactly those numbers mean and what a specific location number in China means to a processor in the U.S. But the technology is not the barrier for that.